Welcome to the Podkey Summary of Louis H. Carpenter. This episode is really about one officer's career, but it opens out into a much bigger story about how the U.S. Army changed across the second half of the 19th century. Edward Carpenter went from a Civil War private to a brigadier general over 38 straight years, and along the way you can see black cavalry service, the making of the Buffalo Soldiers, the hard logistics of frontier war, and the Army trying to figure out what cavalry was actually for. He ends up as a military governor in Cuba, which gives his career this almost startling arc from the Civil War, all the way into America's first overseas imperial phase. Carpenter left Dickinson College during his junior year in 1861 and enlisted as a private, which is already a pretty dramatic pivot. He stayed in uniform for nearly 4 decades, serving through at least 14 Civil War campaigns, then Reconstruction, the Indian Wars, and the Spanish-American War. What makes that rise interesting isn't just personal ambition or endurance. It also mirrors what happened to the Union Army itself. Early in the Civil War, cavalry leadership was often messy, political, and not always especially competent. Over time, combat experience forced the Army to get better at producing officers who could scout, fight dismounted, use firearms effectively, and operate with some independence. Carpenter's career sits right inside that learning curve. He wasn't just present for it. He helped define what successful cavalry leadership looked like after the amateur chaos wore off. One of the most revealing parts of his career came with the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, where he served first as executive officer and later as commander. He was training formerly enslaved men and freedmen for combat in a system stacked against them. There was widespread illiteracy, poor equipment, and a lot of white officers who frankly were not suited to command black troops. The equipment problem alone could have broken the whole idea. The regiment got muzzle-loading infield infantry rifles, which were no good for loading on horseback. So Carpenter adapted. He taught them to operate as mounted infantry, riding to the battlefield and then fighting dismounted. It was practical, not glamorous, and it fit the tools they actually had, instead of the tools somebody should have sent them. He also had to deal with the shortage of literate black non-commissioned officers. His solution was to pair literate white NCOs with black sergeants and set up literacy instruction, which tells you he saw education as part of military effectiveness, not some side issue. At the same time, he seems to have recognized a harder truth about bad white officers. Training could only do so much. Sometimes attrition was the only fix. The regiment built a serious combat record, including Marion and the Second Battle of Saltville, but its service was shaped just as much by the racial violence surrounding it. At Simpsonville, 19 black Union soldiers were reportedly murdered after surrendering, or after being disarmed, which is one of those details that lands with awful clarity. That kind of experience mattered inside the unit. It deepened the regiment's determination to rescue wounded comrades, because the stakes were brutally different for black soldiers. So when people talk about leadership here, it's not just battlefield management. It's training men to fight well, while knowing capture might mean murder. Later, commanding troops of the 10th U.S. Cavalry, Carpenter helped build the reputation of the Buffalo Soldiers. His company reportedly had the lowest documented desertion rate in the regular army, which says a lot considering the prejudice those troops faced and the rough conditions they served under. His men viewed him as fair, firm, and consistent. That combination matters. You don't get loyalty in an unjust system by being charming once in a while. You get it by being reliable every day. In September 1868 at Beecher Island, he led 2 troops more than 60 miles to relieve Forsyth's isolated group of 48 scouts. Forsyth was badly wounded, and that little force was facing around 200 to 300 Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors. A few weeks later at Beaver Creek, Carpenter organized a wagon circle defense and used mass volleys from Spencer, repeating rifles to stop an attack by about 500 Indians. The speed and force of that defense were so effective that the attackers didn't come back for another try, which is one of those moments where preparation and discipline save everyone a much worse day. He eventually received the Medal of Honor in 1898 for gallantry in those 1868 campaigns, especially the forced march to Beecher Island and the fighting on October 15th. Another huge part of Carpenter's work was less cinematic, but maybe even more important. During the Victorio campaign, he directed scouting in the isolated Chinati Mountains and helped produce some of the first reliable maps of that region. That meant identifying waterholes, crossings, passes, grazing areas, roads, and telegraph routes. In an arid landscape, that information wasn't background detail. It decided who could move, who had to stop, and sometimes who survived. From 1875 to 1885, Carpenter and other 10th Cavalry officers charted more than 34,420 miles of previously uncharted terrain, added over 300 miles of roads, and helped establish more than 200 miles of telegraph lines. Those numbers make the point pretty clearly. Frontier warfare depended on logistics and environmental knowledge as much as on fighting. At Rattlesnake Springs in August 1880, that reality came into focus. Carpenter reinforced Grierson's exhausted force and used concentrated carbine fire to repel repeated attempts by Victorio's followers to reach desperately needed water. It's a reminder that these campaigns often turned on resources more than dramatic charges. Sometimes the battle is basically over a map and a spring, which sounds less romantic and much more real. Going back to the Civil War, one of Carpenter's defining actions came at Fairfield during the Gettysburg Campaign. The 6th U.S. Cavalry was badly outnumbered, fighting 2 Confederate cavalry brigades. After Major Samuel Starr was wounded and captured, Carpenter gathered scattered survivors and made them look like the advance guard of a much larger force. That bluff helped delay Confederate cavalry that might otherwise have threatened Union rear areas around Gettysburg, even though the 6th Cavalry took devastating losses. Carpenter was one of only 3 officers from the regiment to escape the melee. Later, as a writer on military history, he strongly supported Sheridan's independent cavalry operations and the Richmond Raid. But there's an important complication here. Later scholarship argues that some of those raids were less successful than their reputation suggests, and that pulling cavalry away for independent strikes may have weakened Union reconnaissance and intelligence. That makes Carpenter interesting in a second way. He was both a participant and a historian of the events, which means he helped preserve a heroic memory of Sheridan's cavalry, even when that memory didn't always line up neatly with later analysis. By the end of it all, Carpenter served as military governor in Cuba's Puerto Príncipe province. That final posting makes his career feel like a bridge from one American era to another, from the improvised violence of the Civil War to the more organized reach of an overseas empire. And maybe that's the cleanest way to understand him. His life wasn't just long service. It was service across a country that kept changing what its army was for. Carpenter's story holds together because it connects tactics, race, logistics, memory, and empire without any of those pieces feeling separate. It's a long ride through American military history, and not always a comfortable one, but it does leave you with a sharper sense of how much change one career can contain. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.